Voices in the Well. Part 1. The Playful Day. The sun was shining brightly over the small village of Willowbrook. Children laughed and played in the fields, their voices echoing through the peaceful countryside. Among them were Sarah, a brave girl with curious brown eyes; Liam, her shy but clever younger brother; Sophie, who loved stories about ghosts and monsters; and Ethan, the oldest, who always acted like the leader of their little group. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, and the children decided to explore the outskirts of the village. They had heard many stories about an old, abandoned well in the woods. Some said it was cursed, while others said it had no bottom. The stories only made it more exciting for the children. "Let's find the well," Sophie exclaimed, her face lighting up with excitement. "Are you sure it's safe?" Liam asked, nervously pulling at the straps of his backpack. Ethan laughed and waved his hand. "Don't be scared, Liam. It's just an old hole in the ground." Sarah smiled at her little brother. "We'll be fine. We're just going to look. Nothing bad will happen." The group set off, following a narrow dirt path that led into the woods. Birds chirped overhead, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. The further they walked, the quieter it became. Soon, the only sounds were their footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. After a while, they saw it. A circle of stones hidden beneath overgrown vines. The well looked ancient, with moss covering the edges. A broken wooden frame stood on top, where a rope and bucket might have hung long ago. "There it is," Sophie said, her voice filled with awe. She ran ahead, but Ethan grabbed her arm. "Wait, be careful," he warned. They all gathered around the well, peering cautiously inside. It was dark and deep, with no sign of water at the bottom. Liam picked up a small rock and dropped it in. The group waited, listening, but they never heard it hit the bottom. "That's creepy," Liam whispered, stepping back. "It's just an old well," Ethan said, trying to sound brave, though his voice was quieter than usual. Sarah leaned closer, staring into the darkness. Suddenly, she froze. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The others listened carefully. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then they heard it, a faint, whispery sound, almost like someone calling for help. "Help me." The voice was soft but clear. It seemed to rise from the depths of the well. Sophie's eyes grew wide. "Did you hear that? Someone's down there," she said. "No way," Ethan replied, shaking his head. "It's probably just the wind." But Sarah wasn't so sure. "It didn't sound like the wind," she said. Liam took a step back, clutching Sarah's arm. "I don't like this. Let's go back." "We can't just leave if someone's in trouble," Sophie argued. "What if they're hurt?" Ethan sighed and looked around. "There's no one else here. It's just us." "I'll prove it." He picked up another rock and leaned over the edge of the well. "Hello," he called, his voice echoing into the darkness. For a moment, there was silence. Then the voice came again, louder this time. Help me, please. Sarah grabbed Ethan's arm. Stop. We don't know what's down there. Maybe we should get an adult, Liam suggested, his voice shaking. But before they could decide what to do, Sophie gasped. Look! She pointed at the ground near the well. There were footprints in the dirt, barefoot, small and faint, as if someone had been standing there not long ago. The group stared at the footprints in shock. Who had been here? And where had they gone? Let's go home, Liam said firmly, pulling on Sarah's hand. We'll come back tomorrow, Ethan added, trying to stay calm. Reluctantly, the children left the well and hurried back to the village. But even as they laughed and played on their way home, the sound of the voice lingered in their minds. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the well. Was someone really trapped down there? Or was it something else? Little did they know, their innocent adventure had awakened something old and restless, something that had been waiting silently in the dark. Part 2. The Disappearance. The next morning, Sarah woke up early. The sky outside her window was cloudy, and the air felt heavier than usual. She couldn't stop thinking about the voice in the well. Was it a person, a ghost, or just her imagination? At breakfast, Sarah looked at Liam, who was poking at his food. He looked just as worried as she felt. Do you think we should go back to the well? Sarah asked softly. Liam's eyes widened. Do we have to? It was so creepy. Before Sarah could answer, the doorbell rang. It was Ethan and Sophie. We have to go back, Sophie said as soon as Sarah opened the door. What if someone really needs help? Ethan nodded. We'll just take a quick look. If we hear anything weird, we'll tell the adults. Liam hesitated but finally gave in. Fine, but I'm bringing my flashlight this time. By the time they reached the woods, the sky had grown darker. Thick gray clouds covered the sun, and the wind was stronger than the day before. The trees swayed, and their leaves rustled loudly, making it hard to hear anything else. When they arrived at the well, everything was quiet. Too quiet. Even the birds weren't singing. The children stood in a small circle, staring at the old stones. Do you hear anything? Sophie asked in a whisper. They all listened, holding their breath. At first, there was only silence. Then it came again. Help me. The voice sounded faint but desperate, as if it were coming from very far below. Sarah's heart raced. She looked at Ethan. What do we do? Ethan frowned. We need to see how deep this well is. He grabbed a long stick from the ground and leaned over the edge, lowering it as far as he could. But the stick wasn't long enough. The well seemed bottomless. What if we drop something with a light? Sophie suggested. She rummaged through her backpack and pulled out a small glow stick. She snapped it, shaking it until it glowed brightly. Then, with trembling hands, she dropped it into the well. They all leaned closer, watching the glowing stick disappear into the darkness. It fell, and fell, and fell. until it was completely gone. No bottom, Liam whispered, stepping back. This isn't a normal well. Suddenly, they heard a new sound, a strange whispering. It wasn't just one voice. It sounded like many voices, all talking at the same time, overlapping and echoing from the well. Do you hear that? Sophie asked, clutching Ethan's arm. It's like a lot of people, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Before anyone could say more, there was a loud cracking sound. The ground near the well shifted, and a small piece of the stone edge crumbled, falling into the darkness. Let's get out of here, Liam shouted, panic rising in his voice. But Sophie didn't move. She was staring at the well, her face pale. Did you see that? She asked. See what? Ethan asked, pulling her back. There was a hand, Sophie stammered, reaching up from the well. The group looked at the well, but it was still and silent now. Sarah grabbed Sophie's hand. Come on, we need to go. Reluctantly, Sophie let Sarah and Ethan pull her away. They ran back toward the village, not stopping until they were far from the woods. That evening, the children gathered in Ethan's backyard to talk about what had happened. Sophie was still shaken. I know what I saw, she said. It was a hand. It looked pale and bony, like it belonged to something dead. Maybe it was just your imagination, Ethan said, though he didn't sound so sure. Or maybe it's a ghost, Liam said, his voice trembling. Sarah frowned. We need to find out more about the well. There must be a reason people say it's cursed. The group decided to visit Mr. Baker, the oldest man in the village. He had lived in Willowbrook his whole life and knew all the local stories. When they arrived at Mr. Baker's house, they found him sitting on his porch, smoking a pipe. He looked up and smiled as they approached. Well, he said. What brings you kids here? Mr. Baker, we need to ask you about the old well in the woods, Sarah said. At the mention of the well, Mr. Baker's smile faded. He set his pipe down and leaned forward. That well? He said, his voice low. You should stay far away from it. Why? Sophie asked. What's wrong with it? Mr. Baker sighed. That well has been there for hundreds of years. People say it's cursed. A long time ago, during a terrible drought, the villagers used to throw coins and food into the well, hoping to please the spirits and bring rain. But one day, a terrible accident happened. A young girl fell into the well and drowned. Her family was heartbroken, and they said her spirit never left. Some even claimed to hear her crying for help late at night. The children exchanged uneasy glances. But it's just a story, right? Ethan asked, trying to sound brave. Mr. Baker shook his head. Some stories are more than stories, boy. They say anyone who hears her voice is in danger. She doesn't want to be alone down there, you see. She wants company. The children left Mr. Baker's house feeling more scared than ever. As they walked home, they agreed to stay away from the well. But that night, something terrible happened. Sarah woke up to the sound of knocking on her window. She sat up, her heart pounding. "Who's there?" she whispered. There was no answer. She got out of bed and pulled back the curtain. No one was outside. But when she looked down, she saw something in the dirt below her window. A trail of small, barefoot footprints, leading toward the woods. The next morning, Ethan came running to Sarah's house. His face was pale, and he was out of breath. "Sophie's gone," he shouted. "What do you mean, gone?" Sarah asked, feeling a wave of panic. "She didn't come home last night," Ethan said. "Her mom says she's missing." Sarah's heart sank. She looked at Liam, who was standing nearby, his face pale with fear. "The well?" Liam whispered. "She went back to the well." Part 3. The Search for Sophie. The news of Sophie's disappearance spread quickly through the village. People gathered near her house, whispering and shaking their heads. The grown-ups believed she might have wandered off and gotten lost in the woods. A search party was formed, and men with flashlights and sticks began looking for her. But Sarah, Ethan, and Liam knew the truth. "She went back to the well," Ethan said firmly as they sat in Sarah's living room. "But why would she do that?" Liam asked. He was hugging a pillow tightly, his face pale. "She couldn't stop thinking about it," Sarah guessed. "She kept saying we had to help whoever was in there." "But she knew it wasn't safe," Ethan argued. Sarah sighed. "It doesn't matter now. What matters is we need to find her." "Are you saying we should go back to the well?" Liam asked, his voice shaking. "Yes," Sarah said, standing up. "We're her friends. We can't just sit here and wait." Liam looked scared, but he nodded. "Okay. I'll come too." Ethan grabbed his backpack. "Let's take a flashlight, some rope, and anything else we might need." The three of them walked quickly toward the woods. The village seemed quieter than usual, as if everyone was holding their breath. Dark clouds still covered the sky, and the air felt heavy, like it might rain soon. When they entered the woods, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves above them. The deeper they went, the darker it became. "I don't like this," Liam whispered, clutching Sarah's arm. "It feels wrong." Sarah tried to stay brave for her little brother. "We'll be okay. We're sticking together." Finally, they reached the well. The sight of it made them all stop in their tracks. The stones looked older and darker than before, as if the well had aged overnight. The wooden frame above it had broken even more, leaning at an odd angle. Ethan turned on his flashlight and shone it around. "Sophie," he called out. His voice echoed through the trees, but there was no answer. Sarah stepped closer to the well. "Sophie!" she yelled into the darkness. For a moment, there was silence. Then they heard it. "Help me!" The voice was faint but clear, rising from the depths of the well. Sarah's heart pounded. "It's the same voice," Liam whispered, "but it doesn't sound like Sophie." Ethan frowned. "Maybe she's down there with whatever is making that sound." Sarah shook her head. No. We'd hear her call us by name. This is something else. The whispering started again. The strange overlapping voices they had heard before. It was louder now, filling the air around them. Ethan pulled the rope from his backpack. We have to look inside. We can't leave Sophie if she's down there. Sarah hesitated but nodded. Be careful. Ethan tied the rope to a sturdy tree nearby and handed the end to Sarah. Hold this tight. I don't like this, Liam said, his voice trembling. What if something grabs him? We'll pull him back up, Sarah said, trying to sound calm. Ethan leaned over the edge of the well and shone his flashlight inside. I don't see anything, he said, his voice echoing slightly. Slowly, he began lowering himself into the well. Sarah and Liam held the rope tightly, watching as Ethan disappeared into the darkness. What do you see? Sarah called down. It's just rocks and dirt. Ethan's voice echoed back. Wait, I see something. Sarah's heart raced. What is it? There's a shoe, Ethan called. It looks like Sophie's. Liam gasped. She is down there. Ethan's voice came again, but it sounded different. Nervous. Wait. There's more. What do you mean? Sarah asked, leaning closer to the edge. There are footprints on the wall, Ethan said. Like someone climbed up. Sarah froze. Climbed up? How is that possible? I don't know, Ethan said. I'm coming back up. This doesn't feel right. As Ethan climbed back out, the whispering grew louder. It surrounded them, coming from all directions. Liam covered his ears. Make it stop. When Ethan finally reached the top, he pulled himself out and collapsed onto the ground, breathing hard. We need to leave. Now. But what about Sophie? Sarah asked. She's not down there, Ethan said firmly. At least not anymore. But something else is. Before they could move, a loud crack split the air. The ground near the well shifted again, and more stones crumbled into the darkness. Then they saw it. A pale, thin hand reached up from the well, its fingers long and bony. The children froze, staring in horror. What is that? Liam whispered, his voice shaking. The hand gripped the edge of the well, and a second hand appeared, pulling something up. It was a face, pale, hollow, and sunken, with empty black eyes. Run! Ethan shouted. The children turned and ran as fast as they could, their hearts pounding. The whispering followed them, growing louder and louder. When they finally reached the edge of the woods, the sounds stopped. They turned back, but the woods were silent and still, as if nothing had happened. Sarah grabbed Ethan's arm. We can't leave Sophie out there. Ethan shook his head. We're not going back without help. Whatever that was. It's not human. They ran back to the village, but when they tried to tell the adults, no one believed them. The grown-ups said Sophie was probably lost somewhere and would be found soon. That night, Sarah sat by her window, staring at the woods. She couldn't stop thinking about the pale face and the voice from the well. "Sophie," she whispered to herself. "Where are you?" The only answer was the wind, whispering softly through the trees. Part 4. The Legend of the Well. The next morning, Sarah, Ethan, and Liam gathered in Sarah's room. None of them had slept well. The pale face they had seen at the well haunted their dreams. "We need answers," Sarah said firmly. She looked at her friends. "Sophie's still missing, and no one believes us about the well. But we know it's connected. How do we find answers?" Liam asked, still looking scared. "We have to learn about the well," Ethan said. "Maybe there's a reason it's abandoned." Sarah nodded. "Let's ask Mrs. Wilkins." Mrs. Wilkins was the oldest person in the village. She had lived there her whole life and knew every story about it. The children often saw her sitting on her porch, knitting or reading. The three of them walked to Mrs. Wilkins' house, a small cottage near the edge of the village. She was sitting outside, feeding the birds. When she saw them, she smiled kindly. "Hello, children," she said. "What brings you here?" Sarah stepped forward. "Mrs. Wilkins, can we ask you something about the old well in the woods?" Mrs. Wilkins' smile faded. She put down the bag of birdseed and leaned forward. "Why do you want to know about that well?" We think it might be dangerous," Ethan said carefully. Mrs. Wilkins studied their faces for a moment, then sighed. "Come inside," she said. Inside the cottage, Mrs. Wilkins made tea and sat down with the children. "That well has a dark history," she began. "A long time ago, the well was part of a small village that used to stand where the woods are now. The people depended on the well for water. But one year, something terrible happened. A little girl named Eleanor went missing." The children exchanged nervous looks. "Her parents searched everywhere for her," Mrs. Wilkins continued, "but she was nowhere to be found. Then, one day, someone heard crying coming from the well. Was it Eleanor?" Liam asked in a small voice. Mrs. Wilkins nodded. "At first they thought so. The villagers gathered around the well, calling her name, but the voice that answered wasn't quite right. It sounded strange, like it wasn't really human." Sarah shivered but didn't interrupt. "Some brave men went down into the well to find her," Mrs. Wilkins said, "but they never came back up. After that, the villagers were too afraid to use the well. They believed something evil lived down there, something that had taken Eleanor and the men who tried to save her. Eventually, the village was abandoned, and the forest grew over it." "What happened to the well?" Ethan asked. "The villagers tried to seal it," Mrs. Wilkins said. "But no matter what they did, it would always reopen. Over the years, people who went near it reported hearing voices, crying, whispering, sometimes even laughter. They said the voices tried to lure them closer." Liam's hands trembled. Do you think it took Sophie?" Mrs. Wilkins' face grew sad. "If she went near that well, it's possible. But you must promise me," children, stay away from it. That place is cursed. Sarah clenched her fists. We can't just stay away, Mrs. Wilkins. Sophie is our friend. We have to help her. Mrs. Wilkins sighed. If you truly want to help her, you must be very careful. There's an old legend about the well. It says that the only way to stop the voices is to face them and discover their secret. But no one knows what that secret is. Do you know anything else about the legend? Ethan asked. Mrs. Wilkins shook her head. That's all I've heard. Be careful, children. You're brave, but this is not a game. After leaving Mrs. Wilkins' house, the three friends sat under a tree, thinking about what she had said. So the well has been taking people for years, Ethan said. But why? And how do we stop it? We need to go back, Sarah said. Liam's eyes widened. Are you crazy? Didn't you hear what Mrs. Wilkins said? The well is cursed. I know, Sarah said. But if Sophie is in there, we can't just leave her. What if she's waiting for us to save her? Ethan nodded slowly. Sarah's right. Sophie would do the same for us. Liam looked like he wanted to argue, but finally, he sighed. Okay. But this time we need a plan. The children decided to return to the well at sunset. They brought flashlights, ropes, and a notebook to write down anything they noticed. Sarah also brought her phone to record any sounds or voices. As they walked through the woods, the air felt colder, and the trees seemed taller and darker. When they reached the well, they stopped and stared. The well looked even older than before, with more stones crumbling from its sides. Let's record everything, Sarah said. She turned on her phone and held it up. Do you hear anything? Ethan asked. They all listened. At first, there was silence. Then, the faint whispering began again. The children froze. What's it saying? Liam asked, his voice trembling. I can't tell, Sarah said, focusing on the sound. It's like too many voices talking at once. Ethan slowly approached the well and shone his flashlight inside. I still don't see anything, he said. Sarah stepped closer, her phone still recording. Sophie, she called. The whispering grew louder. Then, a single voice rose above the others. Help me. It's her, Sarah said. Ethan leaned over the edge. Sophie, are you there? But instead of Sophie's voice, the whispering turned into laughter. Cold, echoing laughter that made the children step back. What is that? Liam cried. Before anyone could answer, the ground near the well shifted again, and a cold wind blew up from the depths. The children stumbled backward, shielding their faces. When the wind stopped, the whispering was gone. The forest was silent again. Sarah checked her phone. I got it, she said, showing them the recording. What do we do now? Liam asked. Sarah looked at the well, determination in her eyes. We figure out the secret. Whatever's down there, it's not going to stop until we do. Part 5. The Secret of the Well. The next day, Sarah, Ethan, and Liam couldn't stop thinking about what had happened at the well. The laughter, the voices, and the cold wind still haunted them. They knew they had to find a way to save Sophie before it was too late. Maybe the answer is in the old village, Sarah said as they met in the morning. If the well has been here for centuries, then there must be something left from the old village that can help us. Ethan nodded. That makes sense. There might be something there that tells us how to stop the voices. Liam, who was still nervous, shifted uncomfortably. But the village is in the forest. The same forest that is filled with strange sounds and darkness. We don't have a choice, Sarah said. We're the only ones who can help Sophie. We can't be afraid. The three friends gathered their things. Flashlights, a map, and their phones. They also packed some snacks, in case they needed to stay longer. The walk through the forest felt different that day. The trees seemed to be even thicker, blocking out most of the sunlight. The birds were silent, and the only sounds were the crunching of leaves under their feet. Liam kept glancing nervously at the shadows in the trees. Do you think something's watching us? He whispered. Stop it, Liam, Ethan said. You're just scaring yourself. But even Ethan wasn't sure. The forest didn't feel normal anymore. It felt like something was waiting, watching, or listening. After an hour of walking, they finally reached the place where the old village used to be. All that was left were a few broken walls and stones covered with moss and vines. This is it, Sarah said, looking around. The village must have been small. There's not much left. They began searching the area, looking for any signs of the old village's history. Ethan found a piece of an old stone that had strange markings on it. He showed it to Sarah and Liam. What does it say? Liam asked, his voice trembling. I'm not sure, Sarah said, studying the symbols. It looks like an old language. Maybe it's a warning. Ethan took a picture of the stone and looked around. We should keep looking. Maybe there's something else that explains what happened. As they walked deeper into the village ruins, they found an old, broken building that had a door still standing. It was half covered in ivy, but the door was still in place. Sarah pushed the door open slowly. Inside, it was dark and dusty. The air smelled old, like forgotten things. They stepped inside carefully, their footsteps echoing in the quiet room. There was a small table in the middle of the room, covered with old books and papers. Sarah walked over to it, her heart beating faster. She picked up a book that was mostly falling apart but still readable. It's a journal, Sarah said, flipping through the pages. This must have belonged to someone who lived here. They gathered around her as she read the words aloud. The well calls to me in my dreams. It whispers things I don't understand. I fear the voices that come from it, but I cannot stop myself from going closer. I will try to learn its secret, even if it takes my life. The children exchanged worried glances. Who wrote this? Ethan asked. I don't know, Sarah said. But it sounds like they tried to figure out what was happening at the well. They didn't succeed. Liam felt a chill run through him. What if we're not strong enough to fight it, like they weren't? We have to be, Sarah said, her voice firm. Sophie is depending on us. They continued searching the room, finding more books and old papers. Finally, Ethan picked up a strange-looking object. It was a small, round stone with a carving on it. He held it up for Sarah and Liam to see. "What is it?" Liam asked. "It looks like a charm," Sarah said, taking it from Ethan. "Maybe it's something that was meant to protect the village from the well." Ethan nodded. "It could be important. Maybe it can stop the voices." Sarah looked closely at the stone and saw something else carved on it. Another symbol, one that looked like the markings they had seen earlier on the stone outside. This must be the key. If we can figure out what it means, maybe we can stop the voices and save Sophie. But before they could say anything more, a loud crash came from outside the building. The children jumped, their hearts pounding. "What was that?" Liam asked, wide-eyed. "I don't know," Sarah said, holding up her flashlight, "but we need to go now." The three of them rushed out of the building, their flashlights shaking in their hands. They didn't see anything at first, but then they heard the laughter again. The same cold, hollow laughter that had filled the air at the well. "We need to go back to the well," Sarah said urgently. "Whatever we're looking for, we'll find it there." But as they turned to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. It wasn't just one set of footsteps. It was many, like a group of people walking toward them. "We're not alone," Ethan whispered. The children froze, their eyes wide with fear. "Run!" Sarah shouted. They turned and ran as fast as they could, not stopping until they reached the well. The laughter faded behind them, but the footsteps kept coming. They reached the edge of the well, panting and terrified. "What do we do now?" Liam asked, his voice shaking. Sarah looked at the stone charm in her hand. "We have to use it," she said. "I think this is the answer." Ethan looked at her with fear in his eyes. "How do you know?" Sarah didn't answer. She just held the stone out over the well. The air grew colder, and the voices from below grew louder. Then, with a deep breath, Sarah threw the stone into the well. The moment it hit the water, the laughter stopped. The voices grew silent. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, from deep inside the well, a voice spoke, Sophie's voice. "Sarah? Ethan? Liam? Sophie?" They all shouted together. But then the voice stopped, and the silence returned. Part 6. The final part. The silence after Sophie's voice felt like a heavy weight pressing down on them. Sarah, Ethan, and Liam stood by the well, holding their breath. They were waiting for something, anything, to happen. But for a long time, there was only silence. Sarah felt her heart pounding in her chest. "Sophie," she called out softly, her voice trembling. "Sophie, where are you?" There was no answer. The air around them was still, and the only sound was the wind rustling the leaves in the trees. Ethan glanced nervously at the well. What if it didn't work? We have to keep trying, Sarah said, her voice firm. Sophie is down there, and we need to save her. But Liam, who had been staring into the well, suddenly gasped. Look, there's something moving down there. The others turned to see what Liam was pointing at. At first, they couldn't see anything. The well looked just like it always had, dark and deep. But then, something glinted in the dim light. It was a small shape, rising slowly from the depths. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Sophie, she whispered. The shape came closer and they could see it more clearly. It wasn't Sophie. It was something else. A shadowy figure with a faint glow surrounding it. The figure was moving toward the edge of the well, floating just above the water. Sarah stepped back in fear. What is that? Ethan grabbed her arm. We need to get out of here, Sarah. That doesn't look like Sophie. But Sarah didn't move. She couldn't take her eyes off the figure. It was strange and dark, but there was something familiar about it. She felt drawn to it, even though every part of her wanted to run away. Who are you? Sarah called out, her voice shaky but brave. The figure stopped. It hovered for a moment, as if considering her question. Then it spoke. I am the one who has been calling you. The voice was soft, like a whisper in the wind. Sarah's heart raced. What do you want from us? She asked. The figure's shape began to change. Slowly, it morphed into a face. An old, weathered face with empty eyes. It was a face that looked like it belonged to someone who had lived long ago. I am the spirit of the well, it said. I was trapped here long ago. I have been waiting for someone to set me free. The children felt a chill run through them. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift. What do you mean? Liam asked, his voice shaking. Why did you take Sophie? The spirit's face twisted into a sad expression. I did not take her. I only called to her. She was drawn to the well just as you were. I never meant to harm her. Sarah's eyes widened. So, Sophie's not trapped down there? No, the spirit said. She was never trapped. She was only lost in the voices, like you were. She is safe now because you answered the call. The charm you threw into the well broke the spell that kept me here. I am free now. The figure began to fade, its shape dissolving into the air like mist. No, wait, Sarah shouted. What about Sophie? Where is she? But the spirit didn't answer. It was already gone. The well was quiet again. The voices had stopped. For a moment, the three friends stood in silence, not knowing what to do or say. The well, which had once been so full of mystery and fear, now seemed calm and empty. Then, from behind them, they heard a voice. Sarah? Ethan? Liam? They turned quickly, and there was Sophie, standing a few feet away. She looked tired, but she was safe. Sophie, They all cried, rushing toward her. Sophie smiled weakly. "I'm okay," she said. "I don't remember much, but I heard your voices. I heard you calling me." Sarah hugged Sophie tightly. "We were so scared. We thought the spirit had taken you." Sophie shook her head. "No. I heard something at the well. I heard voices, but they didn't sound like anyone I knew. I felt like I was falling into them, like they were pulling me down. But then I heard you, Sarah. You said my name, and I felt strong again. I don't know what happened after that." Ethan smiled. "The spirit is gone. The well is finally free." Liam looked around, still unsure. But what was it? Why did it want to trap people? Sarah took a deep breath. "I think the spirit was trapped for a long time. It wanted to be free, but it couldn't do it alone. It needed someone to answer the call, someone who wasn't afraid. It needed us to break the spell, to set it free." Sophie looked at the well one last time. "I don't ever want to go near it again." Sarah nodded. "We won't. We've done what we needed to do. We've set the spirit free, and now we can move on." As the three friends walked back toward the village, they felt a sense of peace. The voices that had haunted them were gone, and the well, once a source of fear, now seemed like just another old part of the village. They would never forget what had happened. They would never forget the voices in the well. But now, they knew the truth, that sometimes even the darkest secrets can be set free. And with that, they walked home, knowing they had faced something powerful and had come out stronger. That's the end of the story. If you enjoyed the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more exciting tales. Check out our other videos and share your thoughts in the comments. Stay tuned for the next adventure. Thanks for watching.